Thank you very much for the invitation. The conference organisers asked me to focus in particular on fault lines that are disrupting work and leading to new forms of regulation or re-regulation. So I want to focus on the process of market making, which is all too often described as a process of deregulation. It's actually about a change in the way in which the market is actually regulated. And I want to look at the way in which the geographic boundaries of the market are being changed and how that then has an impact on our national systems of industrial relations and how that creates a fault line in our systems of labour market regulation. The market-making process is a political process. Markets might be created by capitalists, but they are delineated and defined by the states. They're ordered by institutions and they're governed by various rules and regulations. So I want to talk about how the way in which the markets are changing is impacting on national labour markets. If you're wondering about these images on the slides here, these are all images from the Taylor report in the UK, which is about good work. So the future of work in the UK is going to be white middle-class people sitting around computers talking about things. And this is the whole booklet is just full of these images. I did hesitate because I thought, I wonder what the CRIMT logo is like, but you can see the CRIMT one is much better. There's even somebody with a toolbox, look, in the middle there. Somebody. Okay, so the fault line in industrial relations. Unlike economics, which claims to have lots of laws about prices, supply and demand, interest rates, all kinds of things, we really only have one law in industrial relations. And that law is that trade union organisation and collective bargaining tends to follow the contours of the product market. So if you look at the early work of John Commons, for example, unlike Marx, who was focused on the labour process and the control of work, Commons was much more interested in the control of markets and how protective organisations such as trade unions developed and how what they were trying to do was control not only the labour market, inferior wages, but also the product market. So and the basic argument is that if we want to regulate the labour market effectively, we have to be able to regulate the product market. So the one depends on the other. Now, when Commons talks about the marginal producer, he characterised these people as the menace of competition, which always makes me think of Dennis the Menace. And in America, you have your own Dennis the Menace, who appeared first in 1951, the very same year that our British Dennis the Menace appeared. But I think what Commons was really talking about was the American Dennis the Menace, Dennis Mitchell, who is basically a good kid, but inadvertently gets himself into trouble. The British Dennis the Menace went out looking for trouble. He was a deliberate menace. So whereas you can see the American Dennis the Menace is quite an angelic-looking kid, the British Dennis the Menace has got the Sid Vicious haircut and wore a jumper like Kurt Cobain, you know, the red and the black stripes. I must confess, I do have an affinity to Dennis the Menace. My first ever publication was in the Beano. I had the star letter in the Beano comic in 1980 when I was at university. I've still got the copy, and I've still got the T-shirt, which doesn't fit. So the difference, I suppose, if you like, is if we're talking about music still, the American Dennis the Menace is a bit like the Monkees, whereas the British Dennis the Menace is like the Sex Pistols. Yeah? So Commons was talking about this idea of these menaces appear both within the market, within your own domestic market, and also internationally as well. So it's competition from abroad. And the argument about the establishment of the International Labour Organization was that the International Labour Organization was set up to equalize competition amongst nations so that we could liberate trade without danger to living standards. So the idea was that we would have international standards that everybody would comply with, which would allow countries to maintain the integrity of their social welfare systems, their systems of industrial relations, collective bargaining, etc., etc. And this was always the nature of the European project. The nature of the creating a single market in Europe was that it was governments that would decide when trade would be liberalised and for which products, what controls over capital movements we would have, what would permit workers or firms to seek employment in other countries, etc. So member states were controlling the interaction between economic liberalisation and the requirements of their national industrial relations systems, public welfare, public infrastructure systems. And we would only allow the market to expand within limits that allowed us to maintain the integrity of our national industrial relations systems, social welfare, etc., etc. So the system that we're basically talking about is basically a nation-state-based system of regulation. So even when we think about international regulations, it's about horizontal regulation of markets. The International Labour Organization sets standards that the tripartite constituents then apply in their particular country. So it's not a vertical system where we have this kind of going from international to national to local. It's basically setting an international standard that countries then implement. And the problem is that system has been disrupted by globalization and global production networks, etc. And this point is very much on the agenda of the current Director General of the International Labour Organization, Guy Ryder. So the question that we're faced with then is what happens when capitalists come up with ways of being one step ahead of the legislator? What happens when the spread of markets outpaces the ability of societies to regulate those markets, to politically adjust to the growth of the market, never mind shape the direction in which those markets run? What happens is that we break the law of industrial relations. And we see that through the violation of employment rights in different countries. And we see it in particular through this decoupling of international economic development, through the development of the product market, as opposed to our national systems of social protection and the ways in which we try to regulate the labour market. So just very quickly, you can see here the lower the line, the greater the number of violations of labour rights. So we see across the world increasing violations of workers' employment rights. Employers are just getting nasty. They're becoming Dennis the Menace British, not Dennis the Menace, Dennis Mitchell American. If you look at the International Labour Organization, sorry, this hasn't come out very well, has it? The solid columns are there to show you the number of conventions that are being passed in 5-year periods. So at a time when work is being transformed, when new jobs are being created, when new types of contractual relationships are developing, there are actually fewer and fewer international conventions being passed to try and regulate those changing workplaces and nature of work. And we also see a significant decline in the number of ratifications of conventions. The blip there is, you can't see it very well, but that's just because of countries ratifying the worst forms of child labour convention from 1999. Why is that? Well, the reason is that employers are opposing any new international conventions. They don't necessarily vote against at the International Labour Conference every year, but what they do is they abstain and they fail to participate. And because of quorum rules in the International Labour Organization, non-participation or abstention is equivalent to voting no. So you might avoid some of the public disdain by voting against a particular convention, but you have exactly the same effect on the outcome. I think what was particularly interesting in 2012, this was an issue that had been rumbling on for quite a while in the International Labour Organization over the right to strike. It obviously came to a head in 2012 to coincide with the election of Guy Ryder, who's got a background in the trade union movement rather than most of the directors of the ILO have been from the government side. But the employers went on strike. The employers walked out at the Committee on the Application of Standards. So for the first time since 1927, there was no review of labour standards undertaken by the Committee of Standards at the ILO. What they were objecting to was the interpretation, the legal interpretation of the Committee of Experts on the application of conventions and recommendations. So CAS, the Committee on the Application of Standards, is a tripartite kind of political body, but the Committee of Experts is a committee of legal experts. The employer's claim was that there is no right to strike enshrined in the Convention on the Freedom of Association and the Protection of the Right to Organise. Both in practice and in law, that was clearly incorrect. And what they were really objecting to was the interpretation of the Committee of Experts being taken as the official view of the International Labour Organization, rather than the Committee on the Application of Standards. So what they were objecting to was the process of soft law becoming hard law. They were objecting to countries using those international standards and the rulings of the Committee on Experts as a reference point to influence standards in their particular country. So what they were really demanding was the right to regime shop. They didn't want standard definitions of workers' rights across country. They wanted to be able to exploit differences in regulations across different countries, what people refer to as spaces of exception in the global economy. So in our modern economy, where we have these spaces of exception, where particular workplaces, particular groups of workers, or particular employment laws, these rights are removed deliberately often from particular categories of workers, it's kind of turning work upside down. So if we think about, for example, areas of employment which were previously localised both for firms and labour, such as agriculture, we see a big increase in migrant labour, for example, in the agriculture sector, which creates all kinds of challenges for protecting workers' rights. If you think about localised transport and distribution services, bus services, for example, these are areas now where international firms, mobile capital, is able to provide those services. So all these kind of traditional relationships that we would see are being turned upside down by globalisation and the emergence of global firms. The image at the top left there is Michael O'Leary. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Ryanair, low-cost airline, which is the biggest airline in Europe in terms of number of passengers flown within Europe. And I'll come back to this particular character in a moment. So basically what Commons argued was that whenever you put the consumer in control, they will favour these marginal producers. And that's what creates the kind of race to the bottom in terms of terms and conditions. Now what Commons argued was that this then creates a political struggle where both employers and workers try to regulate the market. So it's not just workers who are doing this, it's employers as well have an interest in regulating some of these menaces, these marginal producers who enter the market. And of course what we're dealing with today is the Sex Pistols rather than the monkeys. So what we have today is what we might, if in the past we had these protective forms of market integration, I think what we're talking about today is injurious forms of market integration, where we go from a system of structure to conduct regulation. So a great example of structural regulation were bilateral air service agreements in civil aviation. Two countries would agree that different airlines would fly. They would specify who was allowed to fly, which airlines, which airports. They would set the capacity, the prices. We regulated the structure of the market. What we do now is we say, no, it's an open market. Anybody can compete, and we'll just regulate your behaviour in the market. We don't want you to do certain things, and so we'll regulate post hoc rather than ex ante. So there's a significant change in the way in which the market is regulated. And the problem then is that these menaces are one step ahead of the legislator, and they start to do things that we perhaps didn't anticipate. So here's Michael O'Leary again, in the top left hand. So Ryanair uses all kinds of sexist advertising. And he's regularly pulled up by the advertising standards agencies. They've been done about more than 20 times in the last 5 or 6 years. But they don't care. because they use these as opportunities for more publicity. You'll see also down in the map on the bottom corner, Ryanair fly you to a place called Frankfurt-Hahn. It's a long way from Frankfurt. Frankfurt's right over there. So the employers, Lufthansa, get annoyed about that because it undermines their market position. Because it creates markets with forms of behaviour that we find unacceptable. You may have seen the racist outburst by a passenger on a Ryanair flight about a week or so ago. If you haven't, just type it into YouTube. The cabin crew, the airline had been criticised because nothing was done about it. The Minister of Transport in the UK said, well, actually, although it was a flight going to the UK, it's actually Irish territory. And they were setting off, was it from Spain or something like that? So nothing to do with us. And this is the problem about these markets where you find really unacceptable, offensive forms of behaviour. And the cabin crew don't do anything because the cabin crew get very short training periods, basic safety training, how to sell stuff on the aeroplane. They don't get training dealing with all these kind of customer interaction mechanisms. So let me just give you one example of how we make the market and how that then impacts on work and employment. We currently have proposals in Europe for a revision of regulation on urban bus services. So the European Commission has proposed ending exclusive public service obligations for public operators, or changing the rules for those. What they also want to do is end the current practice where member states can set the limit under which these public service obligations would operate. So, for example, in Spain, where the train network is not as well developed as France, they have a much bigger geographical area around towns and cities where there is a public service obligation to provide transport services to citizens. So the EU wants to have a standard rule for everybody, which will then open up the market to competition, undermine public service. The only condition for denying access to private companies to bus terminals will be capacity. Nothing else. If you want to take a bomb around Europe, put it on a bus. Nobody checks it, and you can just get off right in the town centre, and away you go. They also want to change the residency rules for what we call cabotage, which is the right of a company from one member state to operate domestically in another member state. So by doing all these things, what do? Well, we create new kinds of businesses. So under pressure from the European Commission in 2013, in Germany, they deregulated the bus market in January 2013. Prior to that, there were just 86 licenses for bus operators in Germany. And by June 2013, there were 158 licenses. By September 2014, there were 301 licenses. So you open up the market, new companies enter the market. But the companies that enter the market are very different kinds of companies. So Flixbus is a German-based company which recently merged with the other major operator and now controls over 70% of the German bus market, is now the biggest bus operator across Europe into international bus services, doesn't employ anybody, doesn't employ any drivers, doesn't own any buses. It's the Uber of the bus market. It's an anti-union company. And the partners, the companies that actually provide the service, are paid a fixed price per kilometre and performance bonuses based on sales and vehicle utilisation. So what do? You get people driving long hours. So what do we see? Big increase in violation of driving working hours and various other things. So you create a market and then you create forms of behaviour that undermine social conditions across different countries. So isn't this really common sense? If we extend the market and put capitalists in charge, won't that be a cataclysm for the position of workers? I would argue that it is, but policymakers, I don't seem to have woken up to this fact. I think the big lesson for experimentation with better work is the fact that this has got to be a political process. You know, you can go on strike and do industrial things, but behind all this is a policy-making process in markets like the EU, which is dominated by the interests of capital, which is creating a market and creating opportunities for forms of behaviour and new business models, use of technology, which potentially undermines workers' terms and conditions of employment. The world is full of Dennis the Menace, I'm afraid.